Strawson starts by considering an ordinary choice situation, one in which you could either give $10 to charity or buy a cake with it. It seems clear to you, he says, that you are truly radically free to choose in such a way that you will be ultimately morally responsible for whatever you do choose. You can do one thing or the other. It is entirely up to you. Now, Strawson makes a connection between having free will, being able to choose freely, and being morally responsible for one's actions. True or ultimate responsibility, what other philosophers call moral responsibility, exists, Strawson says, if punishment and reward can be fair without having any sort of pragmatic justification, where a pragmatic justification is a justification for punishment or reward simply because it will prevent or encourage the behaviour in the future. It's fair to ask for an explanation of this talk of having free will, since we don't ordinarily go around saying that people have or don't have free will. All it means, at a first pass, is being free to choose. Being free to choose to do the thing or not to do the thing. And plausibly, unless we have free will, unless we're free to choose to buy the cake or not to buy the cake, we're not morally responsible for buying the cake or not buying the cake. Here's Strawson's basic argument, somewhat simplified. Suppose you chose the cake. You decided not to give the money to charity after all and bought the cake with your $10 bill. Well, why is that? Well, that's because you had certain, as Strawson calls them, principles of choice. You had certain preferences, values, and ideals. That's at least part of the explanation of why you chose the cake as opposed to giving the $10 to charity. Now, to be morally responsible for choosing the cake, you must be morally responsible for having these principles of choice, for having these preferences, values, and ideals. And, the argument continues, to be morally responsible for having P1, those principles of choice, you must have chosen them in a reasoned, conscious, intentional fashion. But choice is only possible against a background of certain principles of choice. If you had no preferences or values or ideals, then choice would be impossible. So choosing P1 requires having other preferences, values, and ideals. Call those P2. And again, you have to be morally responsible for having those. Well, once all that is granted, then we're obviously off on this infinite regress of principles, as Strawson says, and so on. Here we are setting out on a regress that we cannot stop. True or ultimate self-determination is impossible because it requires the actual completion of an infinite series of choices, of principles of choice. So true or ultimate moral responsibility is impossible because it requires true or ultimate self-determination. In other words, using a bit of Latin, Strawson says, we are not self-caused, not causa sui. According to him, that's the only way in which we can be morally responsible for our actions, by being self-caused. Because, again, according to him, it's impossible to be self-caused. Ultimate moral responsibility is impossible. And whatever you think of Strawson's argument, the upshot, as he points out, is surely really disturbing. if one takes the notion of justice that is central to our intellectual and cultural tradition seriously, then the consequence of the basic argument is that there is a fundamental sense in which no punishment or reward is ever just. It is exactly as just to punish or reward people for their actions as it is to punish or reward them for the natural colour of their hair or the natural shape of their faces. So the consequences of this argument that we have no free will, and so we are not morally responsible for our actions, are profound. Now, Strawson's argument doesn't have as a premise anything from physics, but it's clearly related to what is perhaps the most widely discussed argument for the conclusion that we have no free will. And this argument does depart from a premise about the physical world. So determinism is the view that the state of the universe at any past time, together with the laws of nature, fix the state of the universe at any later time. So given some earlier state of the universe, S1, and the laws of nature, call them L, L and S1 entail that at some later time the universe is going to be in state S2. So if the universe is deterministic, that by itself is controversial and probably not at the moment known, but if the universe is deterministic, then the state of the universe, way before you were born, combined with the laws of nature, together entail that you're doing whatever it is you are actually doing, because they together entail that the universe is now in exactly the physical state that it's actually in. For more on this, see the introduction to chapter 13 in the Norton Anthology. Suppose that that's right. Suppose that the universe is deterministic. We'll discuss this argument in a bit more detail in the next lecture. Then this gives us another argument against free will. Suppose you chose the cake. Then your taking the cake was entirely determined by two factors, both of which were completely outside your control. One of those factors was the laws of nature that govern how the universe dynamically unfolds. And the other factor was some state of the universe that obtained long before, maybe billions of years before, you were even born. Those two factors, L and S1, together entail, in the logical sense, that you took the cake. You had nothing whatsoever to do with the laws of nature. You had nothing whatsoever to do with this prior state of the universe, S1, yet those things combined determined, guaranteed, that you took the cake. So how could you have chosen freely? To be continued next time. Charles, anything to say to the students?
Yes, thank you. Read Ayer and Chisholm for Wednesday.
We'll see you then.